Hey, um, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome, everyone. I'm Berta Sistvedt. I'm the Director of Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE and head of our London office. And it's my pleasure to chair this second session in our evidence dialogue series on what works for investing smarter in climate action, which is co-convened by 3IE and What Works Climate Solutions. So first, I would like to warmly welcome our panelists and thank you for joining us today. We have Ruth Stewart, who's Director at Alive at Future Evidence Foundation. We have Ian Mitchell, who's a Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Euro Programme at the Centre for Global Development. Then we have Ola Jackson, Senior Climate Manager at SIF, and Aki Kachi, Program Manager Latin America at the IKEA Foundation. Thank you all for being part of this important conversation. A couple of weeks ago, we kicked off our seminar series with a panel on state of the evidence on what works to inform climate action. Then our panelists helped us see both the promise and limitations of the current evidence base. They made a compelling case that we can and should be making smarter, more evidence-informed decisions today based on the evidence available. But they also highlighted the large gaps in the evidence base on the effects of climate change programming, as well as issues of quality, fragmentation, and coordination, among others. And the analysis by Ian Mitchell and colleagues at CGD, where they're looking at the scale of evidence compared to the level of investment in climate is I think sobering, and every time I look at it, it kind of hits home. So it suggests that only a tiny fraction of the 100 billion in annual public finance for climate action is supported by rigorous evidence. And so taking an example that they're using in the analysis, compared to a field like nutrition, where they identify 136 evaluations per 1 billion invested in ODA. In climate, the figures for mitigation is less than 1 evaluation per billion invested, and for adaptation, it's 2.5. So, in short, the evidence base that we're looking at pales in comparison to the scale of investments going into climate change mitigation and adaptation. And in many areas, we are flying blind without robust evidence underpinning action. And this is an area where science has been fundamental in getting the issue on the agenda and convincing the global policy community, governments and NGOs, the private sector, that this is an issue that we need to pay attention to. So why has the evidence movement championing the use of rigorous evidence to guide investments not got more traction in the climate field? And as the stakes, even as the stakes are growing higher, we're not really seeing an increase in or dramatic increase in attention to this issue. So, and then what can those of us that care about this issue do to change this and make it different? So these are some of the questions that we will be focusing on in today's panel. And there are several dimensions to this kind of main issue of why there's been so little progress. We will begin by looking at what makes causal evidence more difficult and costly to produce in the climate space. And we want to understand both the barriers and the breakthroughs. From there, we will zoom out and look at some of the structural, political and cultural barriers to building a stronger evidence infrastructure for climate action. And then finally, we will turn to what might be done about it. So this is a conversation about collective action and what it takes to shift norms and incentive structures to shape climate investment decisions. There are no easy questions. These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. But we think that they're the right questions to be asking, and are really fortunate to have panelists with a depth of experience and willingness to engage honestly with these issues. So before we kick off, a few quick housekeeping notes. We would like to know who is in the audience. So if you can please use the chat to introduce yourself, name and organization, and where in the world you are connecting from. That's always nice to know. And then you can also submit questions to the panel by using the Q&A box. So if you have questions, don't use the chat for that, use the Q&A function. And if it's to a specific panelist, please indicate that in your question. And then we encourage you to engage in the discussion and the series in social media. So please tag us and share your questions and comments, and use the hashtag evidence dialogues if you're posting on LinkedIn. So with that, let's get started. With the first question to all of our panelists, from your experience in climate research, what is it that's making the supply of causal climate evidence difficult to deliver? And what opportunities have emerged in evaluation and synthesis in recent years that might improve our ability to conduct research more efficiently and in ways that makes it more attractive to evidence users? So we'll start with Ian, then Ola, Aki, and Ruth. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Berta. Thanks for mentioning the research as well. My colleague Beata Sikotska had the idea of putting together that comparison of the different sectors relative to spend, and we were struck by it. So your first question is about the supply. It was good to have this question because mostly I'm critical of the demand from development agencies for this evidence, and it was interesting to think about why, what's the challenge with the supply, and when you do think about it, it is very challenging. On the mitigation side, we're trying to measure what is basically an invisible gas and how it varies between two different states of the world, one of which is constantly evolving anyway. So I think not many climate finance projects are pure mitigation, but I think that is a really significant technical challenge for researchers to tackle. And to be honest, so is adaptation. I mean, some adaptation projects, of course, can be agricultural and sort of long-term, yield increasing, but a lot of them relate to stochastic events. So maybe you'll have a road that's more resistant to floods, and so those are not very frequent events. And so to really test that properly in a kind of counterfactual framework, requires a lot of commitment. So when I did think, I did have to concede, I guess, that this is not just a demand problem. I suppose I had another couple of thoughts that may be more constructive. I mean, I guess another challenge is, and I hinted at this just now, in both mitigation and adaptation, it's very often not the primary driver of the project that's being undertaken. I mean, adaptation literally says it, doesn't it? It's an adaptation to another project. And so that makes it very difficult. So what in an appraisal framework, as in when you're doing a cost benefit analysis before you do the research or the evaluation, you're trying to establish how much extra cost has been incurred by either mitigation or adaptation. And even that in itself is a difficult exercise. So the partial nature of adaptation and mitigation in a project, I think, is a challenge, but it's one that policymakers and researchers should be meeting, because if you think this is a successful adjustment to your project, then you should be demonstrating it. So that is a major challenge, and then the third one, I guess, is a challenge of counterfactuals. So I think usually in evaluations you can get away with measuring, two places over time, one with the intervention and one without. I think with the nature of changing energy systems, maybe that's not adequate, and you have to think harder about that. And the same is true for adaptation as well, where two regions or places may not be the same in terms of climate. But what I would say, just on sort of to jump ahead a bit to best practice, when we looked at the World Bank's climate mitigation portfolio, interestingly, not many of their mitigation projects actually measure greenhouse gases as a key performance indicator. But the ones that do, I would commend the way they do it. They look quite carefully at the energy mix in the country and what fuel source is being displaced if they're creating, for example, clean energy. And they're quite sophisticated about it. So I would definitely, as a starting point for appraisal and for evaluation, if you are doing mitigation projects, then we thought that was quite a thorough way to look at it. Let me pause there, and I can rant about demand maybe in subsequent questions.
Thank you, Ian. Aki, over to you.
Um, I think there is actually quite a lot of demand, and because funders and decision makers actually do want to be able to justify that they are making good decisions, and they want to be making good decisions, and they want people to justify that they are making good decisions. But I mean, Ian mentioned, I think that the fundamental issue here is that we can look at this on a micro level and think about impact, say, about putting one solar panel on one house. And then we can think about this at a macro level, either on the level of energy systems and or greenhouse gases globally, and relating that solar panel on that one house to its impact in terms of displacing electricity at different times of day, depending on this and on the electricity mix in one country, and then making some kind of hypothesis about what would have the country have done otherwise. What are the future prices of solar panels globally? What will China do in terms of subsidizing its production of solar technology? We have many people making guesses at this. I mean, IEA is famous for always missing fantastically their projections in terms of the expansion of renewable electricity. But proving this counterfactual in terms of impact it's a wicked problem in terms of climate change. And it's on some level, I mean, we can talk about the impact. We can say this many megawatts or kilowatts of electricity were produced by this many houses, and we can make a calculation in terms of the average grid emission factor over a day or a month or a year. But ultimately, it's always going to be a guess. And I think there's also there's a trade-off between the precision of information and evidence and how much we can be innovating going forward. I think it does make sense to pause and reflect, but the world is changing very, very quickly. And usually the way that we guess the way the future is going to be is quite wrong. I think just a few months or weeks before the US-Israeli war on Iran, no one could have known what the global response to a fossil fuel shock is going to be. So in terms of gauging impact and producing evidence for impact, it's always going to be an inherent challenge on what is evidence and to what extent do our guesses about the future in terms of counterfactuals actually pan out.
Thank you, Aki, for those reflections. Ola.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, great to hear from the other panelists. I mean, on this question around the supply of causal evidence, there's a number of different constraints within climate and when it comes to climate interventions and the style of interventions that we often see within the climate space, because it's not typically service delivery. Some service delivery may exist, but a lot of the work is broader systemic work, which then does present a really big challenge when we're trying to seek causal evidence. And, it has been touched upon by other panelists, the counterfactual point, but I did also have a couple of thoughts on that, on why it presents such a challenge. It's, obviously for the fact that the work is targeting systemic change, but even in areas where the intervention is more at a city level or a country level, it's very rare that you're going to have another city or country that is similar enough on enough metrics that it's actually going to provide a meaningful comparison. And a challenge that this also presents is that some of the work, unfortunately and more recently, a lot of the climate work isn't visible from just looking at indicators alone. Like a lot of the achievement isn't, because some of the work is actually on preventing it backsliding. And then when we don't have that counterfactual, it's hard for us to understand, well, what could the repercussions have been? What status would we have been in without the intervention? And then there are also data availability challenges that really play into this as well. So, for impact evaluations that are targeting those levels of systemic change, we wouldn't be able to run surveys that wouldn't really put it in many instances. And the type of impact level data is often too far away. If we're looking at emissions levels, that's far too far away from an individual intervention to be able to draw that causal link. And then there are data points at the more outcomes level, if we're thinking about things like uptake of climate solutions, or whether it's EVs or solar panels, and funding going into those solutions are really good outcome indicators. But in reality, it's actually still quite difficult to draw causal evidence from that level of indicator. The granularity isn't often there, nor is the coverage. In some places it is, some places it isn't. And as we get further down that causal chain, it may be easier to actually draw a causal link if you're more looking at your intermediate outcome levels. But then there's even less data available at that level. So it's the level of, what happens before the uptake in EVs, or, before the uptake in financing going to solar panels or whatever it may be. And then another challenge that couples this is that actually a lot of organizations haven't been in the habit of routinely collecting lots of detailed monitoring data at various levels. So then for the evaluation, they sometimes have to then build that up retrospectively. And then kind of just final point on this was that, for this reason, we actually often see in this space more theory-based evaluations, because they are better suited to evaluating complex systemic changes. And for those to be really credible and insightful, they really need to draw upon a very broad range of interviewees, going beyond those delivering the work, to interviewing a whole range of people supported, whether it's maybe business leaders, maybe policy makers supported, or others. And in reality, it can be very difficult for outside independent consultants and evaluators to secure interviews with key informants, with bellwethers. And I think more so than in other sectors is this an obstacle that we come up against. So even in those more adaptive, kind of creative forms of theory-based evaluation, that does really become one of the quite practical challenges that we do see. So yeah, I think quick overview of some of the challenges. They obviously can be overcome, and later in the discussion we're going to get to some of the opportunities and ways they can be overcome, but I think it explains why there's not quite the level of causal-based evaluation in this space. Back over to you, Bertie.
Thank you so much, Orla. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. So maybe first to say how exciting it is to see so many people around the world joining the call, and that this is, and I know enough of you to know that I can't blag this and pretend I'm a climate researcher, because I'm not. I work in evidence and evidence synthesis and across a whole set of different sectors. And so my reflections are based on that, based on reading bodies of evidence that I might be completely new to and trying to engage with those methods. So I've been doing this work for nearly 30 years now, and I started in kind of clinical health. That seems straightforward. But then as soon as you move from there to health systems, you add complexity and complex and different geographies and all of these different challenges about measuring causality. And the further, or not the further, the more I've moved from one discipline to another, So working about interventions in schools, and then microfinance, kind of international development work, and then climate work, the more I've realized that we bring particular frameworks for what's causality, what is a nice straightforward experiment, what's affordable and not affordable, and we bring those framings and we use them to judge the bodies of research. So when I think about the climate evidence, I think these aren't necessarily new challenges. It is different, but then everyone argued that education was so dramatically different from healthcare that we couldn't possibly build an evidence infrastructure, measure causality, etc. And actually those systems are a bit more mature and those gaps are a bit smaller now. So I'm confident that with this extraordinary diversity of expertise that approaches climate from so many different directions, because climate isn't really a thing, is it? It's a thing only when it relates to something else, whether it's transport or health or energy. So we've got these different framings and different areas of expertise that we're bringing together. And I think that that's quite exciting and that brings an opportunity. Aki hinted at this kind of wicked problem. And I think if there was uniformity in how we measure causality, and we were all sitting here going, oh, well, it's very straightforward, isn't it? We do 1, 2, 3, then we'd probably be missing something. So the fact that there's a huge diversity of perspectives on how to do this, I think is probably a strength that we should be working with rather than a weakness that we should be denying. So I'm optimistic, and I think we can keep chipping away at this challenge together. Thanks, Bit.
Excellent final point to that question, Ruth. Then to look at, so we've talked about the technical challenges, and Ian talked about some of the demand side challenges, and so kind of diving a bit into this, and what do you think are the structural, political, and perhaps cultural barriers to building a stronger evidence infrastructure and culture for climate action? So we'll start with you again, Ruth.
Thanks so much. So on reflection, there are lots. Of course, there are like structural, political, and cultural covers, huge package of challenges. I think we've talked a little bit about actually methodological cultures in how we approach this. Of course, there's technical elements behind those methodologies, but it's also about cultural shifts and cultural differences. I think as we think about these different disciplines and subdisciplines that come together to try and tackle this particular problem, there are just as many structural and political realities and all sorts of nuance that sit behind them. I think there's probably a meta issue, or a kind of whatever that is, a kind of bigger framing, which is that the research field and evidence even within that, so an even smaller kind of slice of the research pie, doesn't always engage very well with the real world. And so there is a kind of structural challenge for all of us, that the way in which academia and research, even research funding, are structured aren't necessarily cognizant of the realities of how you collect data in a particular environment, how contexts are different, etc. So I think there are some structural challenges that we're all kind of trying to navigate in the space. I don't think they're necessarily unique to climate, and it'd be interesting to hear from the other panelists, whether you disagree with me on that, but there are very specific cultural and structural and political elements that are climate specific. I mentioned earlier that I'd worked in evidence-based education. I was like a junior researcher taking notes in a meeting that was full of academics, head teachers and professors, all talking about whether you could measure causality in education. And there was a massive bun fight. They were all arguing, no way, it's impossible. We've moved through that. So I think we can move through that in this climate space, and some of those barriers and structures, political, cultural, can shift. And we've seen them shift in other disciplines. So I think climate's really well placed to build on what other areas have learned, but also to bring something unique. I think crisis is a really good impetus for moving forwards. It's, the planet's burning. We don't have time to sit and have too many hypothetical conversations about how many angels can stand on the head of a pin. We need to get on with the work. I also think we have an amazing opportunity because of technologies that are shifting. So there is a massive cultural kind of paradigm shift that's happening at the moment around technology and the role that AI plays in evidence generation and use. And so I think there's a great opportunity there to kind of dive into learning from other disciplines, but also kind of riding this wave and seeing what we can do with it. Over to you, Berta. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Aki.
I think I'm in complete agreement. And it is really not unique to the climate space, also because climate and the problem of climate change and the challenge of climate change is not disassociated from all the other systems that we have out there. And Orla mentioned this question of backsliding, and to think that we may have made progress and we may have had some impact at some point with, for example, a successful adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and who could have predicted that it may be undone in a few years. That's a deeply cultural question, and may be completely unrelated to anything that we may formally think of as something in the climate space. It's a cultural question, sometimes maybe even identity question, that then spills over into having a deep impact on the climate space, but does not originate there and cannot be disassociated from that. And I think that variety of factors that may influence certain outcomes is a fundamental challenge. I once had an idea that it was the size of the diplomatic service in Denmark that led to maybe a weak COP presidency and a failure of the COP in Copenhagen. And comparatively, France has a very big, broad diplomatic service and was able to do a lot of outreach and engagement with many different countries around the world. And that contributed to the success of the Paris Agreement. I've spoken to many people, the European Commission and the Danish government and the French government, and maybe many people said, no, that's much, much too simplistic. many other factors that led to the failure of the COP in Copenhagen. And I think it's important to think about the different factors and investigate different theories. But it's going to be a very, very long debate.
Thank you so much, Aki. Orla, over to you.
Great, thanks, and brilliant reflections. Aki and Ruth, really appreciated hearing those. And Ruth, what you were saying about likening, the current moment within climate to others, I often reflect on that, and I do think it's really helpful to reflect on, where those sectors began and where they are now. And some of the stats that Birte mentioned at the beginning were really quite stark. But I guess just in addition to those quite stark figures, I do also want to point out that, SIF and many other philanthropies do invest heavily in evidence in recent years and continue to do so, and are very committed to evidence-driven decisions. But, the evidence infrastructure isn't on par with nutrition and health. And maybe, reflecting on that kind of groundswell that there may have been, I'm not exactly sure of the date, but I'm going to put it at roughly 15 years or so ago. One of the factors driving that will have been an accountability drive. And initially, the accountability drive was where evaluation was also coming from within climate. But, in my opinion, it actually has created a bit of a stumbling block in some senses, and that within the climate community, there are some people who still see evaluation as being quite narrowly for accountability purposes. And it has created a bit of resistance, and there's been some pushback seen, both from implementers and different members within the funder community as well. And obviously, it's very narrow to view evaluation purely as an accountability tool. And I think many people on this call will agree that evaluations enhance effectiveness, they embed learning, and there's many other positive benefits that can come from doing rigorous evaluations. But it does seem that those arguments still need to be made, and that they're probably not the first thing that some others within the community think about when they think of, oh, we're doing an evaluation. Another point actually, which actually relates to something that Ruth was saying about the technical frameworks. I think it's kind of a structural or maybe cultural barrier that relates to it. I think it can sometimes be quite difficult to find the right experts to work on evaluations, and climate action, as we're terming it on this dialogue series, is actually an enormous area. It's huge. It touches all areas of society, of economies, and within that, and the work within that, actually a lot of it is really heavily technical. There's heavy industry, shipping, aviation, energy transformations, multiple very technical disciplines and sectors. And it's quite difficult to find evaluators who have quite a good grounding in those areas. And one of the beautiful things about evaluation as a discipline is that it can be applied across various thematic areas, but there still does need to be that grounding. Otherwise, it can be a bit too much of a leap. And I guess it can be quite hard if you're not coming from that background to really know where to interrogate the broader objectives that the intervention is really aiming at, what the research questions are actually trying to get at. And then I think another cultural point that I've kind of noticed, being in the climate sector, having come from a role that was evaluation, but in a human rights space before, is that there really is, climate is really quite a fast-paced sector. If anything, it feels like it's getting faster and things are changing constantly, and we're constantly having to re-strategize and reflect on what we're doing. And the rate of change maybe is faster than other sectors, but there's also, I think, a very forward-looking nature. And obviously, it's not to say that other sectors aren't forward-looking as well, but I think it's in the lifeblood of the climate sector. And that presents quite a challenge when you're doing evaluations. You might have designed an amazing evaluation to one theory of change, come up with a great design, have started to implement it, and then everything's changed. And then how do you adapt? And it also relates to a bit of a perception that I have picked up on before, that evaluations are quite retrospective in nature. And that is true, but they can have forward-looking value. But I think there is some work to be done there on really ensuring that the evaluations that we do deliver do also deliver those forward-looking insights, and insights are contextualized in changes that may have occurred during the lifetime of an evaluation. And these are a couple of observations, and there are a lot of big believers in evaluation throughout the climate space, but some of these perceptions do exist in a few different places, and I think helping to address them can help us build momentum in this area. Back over to you, Bertie.
Thanks, Ola. Those are some really great observations, and there's a lot to dig into there. But I'll hand over to Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Berta. So, I mean, we've wrung our hands about all the difficulties now, but we've done quite a lot of work talking to different development agencies about how they evaluate climate, how they measure the results, and so on. And I think, as Ruth was saying, I mean, these are real difficulties, and they're real difficulties that have been overcome in other sectors. Evaluating health is not straightforward. Understanding how people how long they're going to live for, when you're doing an intervention at 6 years old is a massive challenge. So I do think I think we have to be careful there's not defeatism or exceptionalism for climate. I think there's, as we all know, hundreds of billions being spent on climate finance. I think the speed at which that target, even though it's been disappointing to some of us that follow the climate finance, ramping up climate finance from sort of 20 billion in 2010 to 115 in 10 years later is actually a steep increase. And so with that, there's obviously been the greenwashing that has happened, and that makes things difficult because the agencies that are providing this finance are exaggerating how climate orientated there are. So when you come to the very first job of working out what the extra cost was of the climate intervention, there's an immediate exaggeration, and that's going to get embarrassing when you get down to evaluate, right? So by the nature of the climate finance target and the exaggeration causes you to have an incentive not to evaluate because you were exaggerating how much climate there was. There's a great the EU's biggest climate project was a few years ago in commitment terms was climate resilient refugee communities in Turkey, and it was never dispersed in the data because basically, it couldn't be credibly called a climate project. And I always come back to that. I think the money was dispersed for refugee hosting, but not for climate. And that's just a great illustration of what would that evaluation have said? I mean, it's silly to call that all of that the biggest project climate finance when really it was about refugee hosting. So there's lots of demand side problems that emerge from that target, but I don't think they're acceptable ones. This money is being spent. I really agree with a lot of what Orla said on the lack of cooperation and the lack of capacity on this. Many providers are doing climate finance, and most of them are asking the same questions. So they should be coordinating really hard through the OECD to have standards, to know where the evaluators are. This capacity should already be in place, and I think building it is definitely a priority and something, maybe in the space we're in now with some more skepticism over the value of the spend and reducing amounts, maybe there will be slightly stronger incentives to do that. I guess the other one that I sort of saved up from the first session was sort of dealing with transformational impacts, and other people picked this up in their comments. We wrote a piece on this. You're hoping that the project doesn't just have the local impact; it has some demonstration or broader impact. I'll put a blog here that we wrote about this. I used to work on animal disease in the government, and so we were always working in kind of hypothetical worlds, and it is quite a well-established framework for dealing with things that might happen and their probabilities and the range of their impacts and how you capture those, and maybe through elicitation from experts kind of bound them and so on. So and I think even though things are changing, I do think development agencies again use that as a bit of an excuse to say, oh, wow, we could evaluate that, but things have changed now, and we know it didn't really work, but the world's different now. We won't do it again, so we won't. We don't need to evaluate it to learn that. So I think the demand and the structural barriers I think are very significant and the main issue here in spite of the technical challenges.
Thank you all for those wide-ranging and I think complementary reflections. So now it's time to look forward, and I think some of you have already alluded to some ideas that you have around that. But to discuss more concretely what you think can be done about this issue. So how can we bridge the researcher, funder, implementer gap so that there is a higher demand for evidence, it's valued, and it's used routinely by institutions and decision makers responsible for climate investments in at least to a much larger extent than what it is currently. So we'll start with Orla, then Ian, Ruth, and Aki.
Thanks very much for the question. I think I'm going to actually start by saying I wouldn't personally go as far as to describe it as a funder, implementer, researcher gap. Funders do extensively use evidence. As if we use evidence to inform decisions, strategy, planning, and many other funders do. There's also really close relationships with researchers and think tanks. So, I don't want to overlook all of that, but I do agree there is more that can be done, and we could really do with building up the demand in the space for evidence, and so that evidence is evaluation evidence is more valued specifically, and then there is that mutually reinforcing cycle where it is also being more demanded, and then it improves effectiveness and strengthens implementation. I think it's clear there's a lot of opportunity. A lot of constraints and observations have been highlighted, and I think we kind of all concur along similar lines. But I did have a few ideas in terms of what can be done to help us improve and build the momentum towards more of an uptick in this area. I think the first one relates to the beginning of this discussion and how hard it is to generate causal evidence. And where that bar should really be in terms of the levels of evidence that are accepted, and some of the innovations in terms of the different types of valuations that can evaluate complex changes and systems level changes. There's a lot of promise there, but there's more to be done in that space as well. I think a frequent challenge is that a lot of the outcomes that are achieved are actually achieved from multiple different actors. We can't just point to one individual organization and say, this enormous outcome was because of them. There's a whole ecosystem acting behind a lot of the changes that are taking place within the climate sector. So we could do with more evaluation methods that better catered to that. And equally that we're able to address the time and kind of pace points that I mentioned as well. If we were able to adapt methods that could deliver those rigorous evaluations, but in quite a concise timeline, without sacrificing quality for speed, and it's no tall order, but I think that really would help. And to kind of address some of the accountability points that I mentioned, I think there also should really also be a focus on not just what works, but why it worked, and that it's really is about learning. I think there could be greater collaborations with evaluators and technical experts or research institutions, and with the two complementing each other. But I think I haven't personally seen that many evaluations where we have brought those two together. And I do think there's huge opportunity there where the technical experts will be able to really genuinely peel back the layers about what's happening and being able to bring in a really independent and critical vantage point. So they could really, really challenge and unpack them with the guidance of the evaluator to apply the methods and keep the rigor that is being required. I think they also really need to be true, genuine partnerships where the two are working together closely the whole way through. And then I think a final one is just on making sure that when evaluations are conducted, that there's more to support the learning piece, and the forward-looking aspects are really being brought out, and that we're really making sure that opportunities aren't missed to use that depth of insight that has been uncovered in the evaluation to really address some of the really current and upcoming challenges, not purely what was directly in the evaluation scope, but the challenges, operational and pragmatic, that the organizations are now facing. And on the learning, I think it's actually coming back to some of the basics of making sure that reports are really clear on the findings, that they crystallize those findings, that they're concise, as concise as feasible, or that there's really good summaries, because they really need to be reaching as broad an audience as possible. And a lot of the audiences really want to reach with the evaluation findings to make sure time change happens. They're very time poor, and so the findings really do need to be boiled down and crystallized for them. So yeah, some reflections there on how we can continue to strengthen in this practice and build up the momentum. Back over to you, Bertie.
Thanks, Ola. There's a really a very useful and comprehensive list, I think, of ways forward. Ian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Berta. I think I've hinted at some of mine already, so I will be brief. But I think, I mean, I like Ola's suggestion for researchers, particularly of, finding expedient and but rigorous ways of evaluating these projects and proposing them to funders. I think that is helpful and important. I think the two things that we are pushing for are, so first of all, better synthesis of what's there already. There are quite a few efforts to look at smart buys. I don't love that phrase, but and what works. But they always seem to sort of balk at climate and go, no, we'll stick to nutrition. Or so I think having some good efforts on those would be good. And those people that have done them already, like FCDO, could publish the ones that they've done. I think they're probably not perfect, but to have a discussion about what we do know and what we don't, and that would create some demand. They would say, oh well, we haven't got any in the agriculture sector, or we've got lots in the agriculture sector. So that would be one kind of practical thing that agencies could do now, and researchers could contribute to. The other thing I've hinted at, and I think Ola's mentioned this as well, is kind of working together particularly, I guess, from my perspective, for providers to work on evaluation together, on standards, on funding, on capacity for climate. And these providers all meet anyway to talk about how they're going to, what they're going to say at COP, for example. These meetings already happen. So having a work program that focuses on evaluation, I think would make a big difference. So those are I like Aki's suggestion that he's hinting, right, that we basically test whether COP is effective by randomizing and having hosts in parallel. I think that was Aki's suggestion, and I'm down for that. There's some great questions in the piece as well that I can't answer, but I'm looking forward to others having a go at.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. Aki, over to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure how big a gap there is. There is a gap, but I think a lot of it is in terms of a communications gap, and Nora alluded to that a moment ago, and sort of the absorption capacity of be able to basically go through all of the available data. Sometimes it actually becomes too much. I do think that it is important to come back and think a little bit more about what indicators we're looking at. And I do think that, we've set up these systems around measuring things like mobilization of climate finance. And I've had many conversations with MDBs and bilateral finance institutions about Rio markers and how different people apply Rio markers and the MDB climate finance taxonomy and methodology very, very differently. And to what extent are we mixing these things in even if we think we have one language? But if we think, I would welcome people looking at a little bit more at that relation to the systemic level, and not only the mobilization of climate finance, but to what extent are we moving towards overall holistic transition and shifting of the trillions in terms of the finance system. And obviously MDBs play a big role in that, but there's also a question of the coalition of finance ministers and what are finance ministries doing in different places, large asset managers, pension funds, et cetera, and not only how much are they investing in coal versus renewable energy, but everything in between. So I think even though that in terms of evidence is harder, I think that it would be very welcome to kind of draw a little bit more of that link between the systemic transformational change of the system in its entirety and how that relates to any specific intervention or funding project. And I think that is a direction that some people are moving in. I mean, at the IKEA Foundation, we'd like to think about, and we are discussing financing studies more not on the individual project or grant level, but more on the systemic level. What system are we operating in a given sector, in a given country, in a given region? But that is a learning curve that I think we need to do together.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Ruth, over to you.
Thanks, Beth, and great to hear that other panelists' contributions. This is my favorite topic. This is what gets me out of bed. Like, why do we have academics and funders and people who need to make decisions living in these different worlds and we're not connecting them? I feel quite strongly that it's not complicated, that if we step back, we know how to do this. We need to start with the decisions that have to be made and who's making them and what their needs are. And then we need to make sure that we're providing evidence for those who are trying to make those decisions in timely and affordable and kind of action-oriented ways. I think there's plenty of barriers. We've been talking about some of them, and some of our colleagues have been thinking a little bit about how do you get started? Where do we start in this process? We know there's some funding maybe in the wrong place or in a could be in a better place. We know there's some limited capacity. We know the incentives are misaligned. But the actual process of starting with decision needs and decision makers' needs, and then making sure you respond to them. And I'll pop the link in the chat, but this is the work that my team do, and my colleagues are on the webinar. We start with the communities of decision makers who tell us about the decisions they need, and then we build evidence bases that respond to that need, and we go around this loop over and over again, essentially building a system. Aki's talking about system responses, essentially building a system that meets need. And we know that when we do that, it breaks down these silos between implementation, funding, research, etc. I saw a great question on the Q&A that was asking something a little bit related to this around when we know there's success in the use of evidence for better decisions, what is it that makes a difference? And I can't speak specifically to climate decisions because I think the work that we're doing within Alive in climate is still relatively new. But I do think we know, so I'm based in South Africa, I've spent a lot of time supporting South African government and other colleagues across the continent to use evidence for decision making. And we know that there is something fundamental about relationships. There's something fundamental about building individual relationships amongst these different groups of people, but also the structural and funding relationships and organizational relationships that need to be in place. So yes, it's about timing. Yes, it's about context. But I think what underpins everything is relationships and the networks that we build. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So we're short on time. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and so I'm going to do a round to the panel and ask you whether you or perhaps more easier, I will leave it up to you, Ruth, Aki, Ian, and Ola to jump in and respond to any of the questions that you feel call to answer. Some of them are quite specific, so I feel a bit reluctant to kind of call one of you out. But there is certainly one about different types of methods that some of you have touched on already. So over to you. Feel free to jump in.
But I suppose I don't know if I can answer this question, but there was a question on the UNFCCC and whether, shouldn't they be consumers of this evidence and be demanding it? And I don't know exactly the answer to that, but that I feel is really important, and maybe that's an opportunity for us to say, to either suggest the UNFCCC pick that up or to think about submitting more of our evidence to those different working groups and bodies to say, maybe this is worth some attention. That feels important. I guess I also wanted to endorse what Aki said. I feel, in the world of climate finance, there's a massive emphasis on mobilizing private finance, and there's really been almost no thought given to whether that's going to achieve anything. So keen of people to embrace that idea. And of course, the big question is how important are those finance flows to moving us to net zero? And that's a macro question. We're doing a bit of work looking at projecting emissions and NDCs and how they and conditionality in NDCs and so on, which could speak to that. But I think that's really the big question for me at a macro level. And so there's the micro effect of whether this money is working, and the macro question of whether we're focusing on the right things.
Anyone else want to jump in before we wrap up?
Maybe a quick one. So I think some of these questions hint to me about better sharing of the initiatives that are happening. And like credit to 3i for this dialogue and this opportunity. So Sabit, you're asking a great question about mapping existing climate evidence. And I know that one of our collaborators and colleagues, Jan Minks, was on your part one of this dialogue, and he's leading an initiative called Destiny, and alongside a number of other initiatives, they're really working on this. How do we build a living repository that's kept up to date, that shows what climate evidence is being conducted, and what the gaps are. So I think we can learn lots from one another. And Sabia, I'm very happy to share with you a bit more on Destiny, that project separately, if that would be helpful. Thanks, Peter.
Right. So we're nearly at time, so I will wrap up and say thank you to our panelists, Ruth, Ian, Ola, and Aki, and to all of you who have joined us today. I think this has been a rich and honest discussion where we have covered, I think, a lot of ground. And it's been really nice to hear your reflections and both the technical and structural barriers. And many of these points really strongly resonate with me, but I think also there are some new insights, and we will try to also bring out in a summary of this session in a better way than I can do now. And so I just want to close by highlighting that we have our third and final session on the 9th of July. And here we will focus on this challenge of building and institutionalizing the use of evidence. We'll hear from practitioners, policymakers, and funders about what it takes to do exactly that. And so we hope that many of you will join us for that conversation. In the meantime, look out for the follow-up materials and share the series with your colleagues who care about evidence-informed climate action. Thanks again, and I hope to see you on the 9th of July. Take care all.